One of the most valuable techniques I've learned as a game developer is an exercise called covers. The idea is to take an existing game mechanic, break it down in great detail, and then re-implement it on your own. This process of deep analysis taps into the game's underlying design DNA and reveals that even the smallest of details reinforce a higher principle. It's similar to other apprentice-based professions. Artists don't start by painting masterpieces. Instead, they learn to imitate the masters. Replicating the work in extreme detail illuminates the intention and approach of the original artist. And along the way, you practice new techniques, acquire more tools, and gain experience. Today's cover is BOXBOY by HAL Laboratory, an endlessly clever puzzle platformer for the Nintendo 3DS. Don't let its adorable exterior fool you, as BOXBOY and its many sequels are some of the best puzzle games this side of Portal. Players control Qbby, who has the power to create blocks at will, allowing him to create platforms and bridges and solve puzzles. BOXBOY pairs this ability with an amazing array of puzzle mechanics and best-in-class level ramping to become a sublimely smart and addictive game. The specific scope of this cover is Qbby's character controller. In other words, the way he moves, jumps, ducks, reacts, and handles. BOXBOY in particular is a great introduction to the platforming genre. The game has a slower pace and digital controls, making it easier to break down the action frame by frame. This simplicity is augmented by the complexity of Qbby's copy mechanics. BOXBOY is simple without being too simple. There are three main lessons from breaking down BOXBOY: the specific platforming mechanics, a hidden grid system, and the game's camera. First up is Qbby's careful character design. Qbby's legs elevate his core collision shape to give players more buffer room when platforming. So if they hit a block at his legs, the collision will count this as valid and resolve Qbby to the top of the block. This is especially important since Qbby's jump is only a single block cell tall. Without his legs, players suddenly need superhuman timing to get on top of anything. Even the horizontal spacing of his legs is important, as this distance defines his horizontal collision size. If both legs go off a ledge, Qbby falls off, which makes visual sense. This allows Qbby to easily squeeze into single-cell gaps, an essential technique for solving puzzles. If his legs were further apart, players would constantly be frustrated by the level design. The developer's generosity is further evidenced by Qbby's jump mechanics. The jump is digital, which prioritizes high-level thought over minute movement. Beyond this, the jump spends over half its airtime at the apex, resulting in an unnaturally floaty action. Switching the jump to analog controls and removing the floaty jump adds unnecessary uncertainty and trickier timing. Qbby's combination of collision shape and jump mechanics de-emphasize mastery of movement. One of the most surprising findings in BOXBOY is its insistence on an underlying grid structure. For instance, when pressing the copy button, Qbby slides over to the nearest grid cell. While overly simple, it really does put players in the ideal location for solving puzzles. The dev team could have made the game strictly grid-based, but players would have lost out on all the feel of a fluid platforming controller. The readjustment system is made less obvious since it only triggers if both of Qbby's legs are in the same grid cell, once again reaffirming the importance of his character design. Even throwing blocks is informed by the grid. You'd expect that toss blocks would travel a set distance. Instead, blocks travel based on which side of Qbby they're thrown from. Blocks from the side move one cell, and blocks from the top move two cells. Essentially, blocks want to keep a single cell between themselves and Qbby. This lets players throw with confidence since they never have to worry about whether a block can make it over a single cell gap. Without the grid manipulation, BOXBOY starts to feel less magical. Suddenly blocks are no longer in just the right place and need constant fiddling. Nudging blocks a pixel or two over isn't the end of the world, but that interaction snowballs when making hundreds of throws over hundreds of levels. The grid makes this issue essentially disappear. The last big mechanic to re-implement is the camera. BOXBOY's camera frames the action based on Qbby's current direction, represented by the red lines on either side. As Qbby runs left or right, the camera slowly moves into place. When copying, the camera uses the same framing rules, but moves more quickly. The green lines represent what happens when players copy blocks in the opposite direction than they're facing. Here the camera shifts in half-grid cells based on how many blocks sit behind Qbby. All of this effort is great. Basically, keep the action on screen. The twist comes from the camera's overly pensive behavior. If players stop moving at any point, so does the camera. If players stop copying at any point, the camera once again stops moving. BOXBOY's camera refuses to act until players decide to act in order to match their current mental state. Switching the camera to be more reactive reveals just how much this changes the game. The constant motion urges players to continue acting, rather than slow down and assess. More often than not, discovering a puzzle's solution involves standing still as players solve it in their head. Therefore, the camera tries its best to provide no extraneous information or editorial. When viewing all these details together, they point to BOXBOY's core design philosophy. It's a puzzle game, not a platformer. The platforming provides lots of tactile feel, but the heart of the game is in solving puzzles. His collision shape makes platforming easier to perform and more forgiving of mistakes. The grid system constantly fudges the numbers to benefit players. And the camera refuses to move without the player's consent, as not to distract their train of thought. While none of this knowledge is necessary for enjoying BOXBOY, it explains why the game is so effortlessly engaging. It's easy to forget that games are made by people, who make thousands of tiny decisions every day. Great games take advantage of these small decisions to ensure they reinforce the game's core design. It's difficult work, but absolutely worthwhile. Thanks for watching. In the description below you'll find several links. The first is to a version of this cover, playable in browser over at my website. The second is to a dev blog I kept throughout the cover, where you can see how many times I rewrote the collision system and how I implemented levels using pings. The third is to an article in Gamasutra, which goes even deeper into this cover.